one of you is my husband.
Eleanor Whitmore's hands trembled as she stared
What are
at
you
two
doing here? You don't
identical
belong in
faces,
this town.
both claiming to be her husband. The marriage contract crumpled in her fist, bore one name, but two massive cowboys stood before her arms, crossed waiting. Behind her, the stagecoach rattled away. Her last $7 wouldn't buy passage back to Boston, and every eye in Redemption Ridge watched to see what the orphan girl would do. She'd come west to escape poverty. Instead, she'd walked straight into scandal. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor's journey to the very end. Comment below with your city name so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The wooden platform beneath Eleanor's boots felt like it might collapse, though she knew the structure was solid. It was her entire world that had just given way. "Ma'am, I'm Jacob Stone." The first cowboy removed his hat, revealing sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water after rain. "And this here's my brother Nathaniel." The second man, identical height, identical build, identical scar above the left eyebrow, nodded once. His silence felt heavier than his brother's words. Eleanor's throat closed. She forced air through it anyway. "The contract says Jacob Stone. One name, one man." "Yes, ma'am." Jacob's voice remained steady, maddeningly calm. "That's what it says." "Then why are there two of you?" A woman laughed somewhere behind her. Eleanor didn't turn. She'd learned in Boston's orphanage that showing your back to mockery only invited more of it. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice deeper, rougher. "Same ranch, same household, same need for help that won't come otherwise." "You lied." Eleanor's voice cracked despite her best effort. "The matrimonial agency never mentioned, didn't lie." Jacob held up one calloused hand. "Said I needed a wife. Said the ranch was big. Said the work was hard. All true. You omitted that there's two of us keeping it running." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Would you have come if we'd told you?" The honest answer burned in her chest. "No." "Exactly." He gestured toward the empty street. "And now here we are." Eleanor clutched her carpet bag tighter, feeling the outline of her mother's Bible through the worn fabric. $7 in coins, one spare dress, 3 letters of reference from women who'd never offered her actual employment, only kind words. She'd traveled 2,000 miles based on carefully worded correspondence and a photograph that showed one man, not two. "I want to go back." Coach left. Jacob pointed down the dusty road where the stagecoach had already disappeared into heat shimmer. "Next one comes through in 11 days. Then I'll wait in town. Town's got one boarding house." Nathaniel's voice carried no sympathy, just fact. "Mrs. Henderson charges $2 a week. You got enough for 5 weeks." Eleanor's silence answered for her. "Thought so." Nathaniel picked up the trunk she'd shipped ahead her entire life, condensed into 30 pounds of belongings. "You can stay at the ranch tonight. Sleep in the spare room. Door has a lock. Come morning, you decide." "Decide what?" Her voice sounded shrill even to her own ears. "Whether to marry both of you? That's not legal. That's not—" "Decide whether to give us a chance to explain properly." Jacob's tone gentled. "Not here. Not with half the town watching like we're a theater show." For the first time, Eleanor looked past the brothers. A dozen faces lined the street, shopkeepers in doorways, ranch hands by the saloon women clustered near the general store. All watching, all waiting to see what the desperate orphan girl from back east would do. Her cheeks burned. She'd fled Boston to escape being a spectacle the charity case passed between church families like borrowed furniture. Now she'd become entertainment for an entirely different audience. "The spare room has a lock," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." Jacob's shoulders relaxed slightly. "And a window that opens. Dresser with 3 drawers. Quilt my mother made before she passed." "We don't force anything on anyone," Nathaniel added. "Not labor, not company, not decisions made under pressure. Eleanor studied both faces, searching for deception. She'd gotten good at that over the years, reading which foster families meant their promises and which ones only wanted free housework. These men looked tired, sun-weathered, hard-worn in the way frontier life wore everyone down to their essential elements. They didn't look cruel. "One night," she said, "then I decide." "Fair enough." Jacob gestured toward a wagon hitched nearby. "It's a 2-hour ride to the Triple S. We should get moving before dark." The wagon had clearly seen better decades. Eleanor climbed into the back seat without assistance, arranging her skirts to avoid splinters. The brothers took the front bench, Nathaniel taking the reins, while Jacob half turned to face her. "You got questions, now's the time to ask them." Jacob's directness was either refreshing or unsettling. Eleanor couldn't decide which. Why? The single word encompassed everything. Why would two men share one wife? Why not each find your own? Nathaniel snorted. "You see any extra women wandering around Redemption Ridge?" "I saw several ladies near the general store." "All married," Jacob said, "or widowed with 6 children, and no interest in starting over, or old enough to be our grandmother. Wyoming Territory's got 10 men for every woman, and most of those women are already spoken for. Matrimonial agencies exist." "Sure do." Nathaniel guided the wagon onto the northbound trail. "And they match single women with single men. Put down that there's 2 of us, and suddenly we're not respectable enough for correspondence." Eleanor gripped the seat edge as the wagon jolted over a rut. "So you deceived me instead." "Wouldn't call it deception," Jacob said. "More like strategic omission." "That's the same thing." "Maybe." He turned forward again. "But you're here now. Might as well hear the whole truth before you judge." The landscape opened up as they left town, endless prairie grass interrupted by distant mountains that looked purple in the afternoon light. Eleanor had never seen so much space. Boston had been all narrow streets and crowded tenements, every inch of ground claimed and built upon. This felt like God had forgotten to finish creating borders. "Our father died 6 years ago," Nathaniel said suddenly. "Fell from his horse, broke his neck. Ma followed him 9 months later. Fever took her, but we both knew it was really heartbreak." Jacob picked up the thread. They'd built the Triple S together. Came out here in '62 with nothing but grit and each other. By the time they passed, they'd put together 300 acres of decent grazing land, a house that doesn't leak much, and breeding stock for horses that could have made us wealthy if we'd had time to focus on them. But instead, you've been trying to keep the ranch running with just the 2 of you. And failing. Nathaniel's knuckles whitened on the reins. "Takes 3 people minimum to run a spread this size. We've hired hands when we could afford them, but they never stay. Winter drives them off, or better opportunities, or just the sheer loneliness of it. So you want a wife who's also a ranch hand." "Want a partner," Jacob corrected. "Someone who'll share the work because it's her home too, not because she's hired labor that'll quit come spring." Eleanor watched antelope scatter in the distance. "And you think one woman can replace the 3rd person you need? Ma did it for 30 years. The simplicity of that statement silenced her. These men weren't looking for something perverted or scandalous. They were trying to replicate what their parents had built, a working partnership that happened to exist outside conventional boundaries. "Your mother didn't marry both of your parents," Eleanor pointed out. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "But she worked alongside both of them, shared the load, made decisions together. That's what we're offering. You're offering marriage. To one of us legally." Jacob pulled a folded paper from his vest. "I'm the one who signed the contract. I'm the one who'll stand before a judge if that's what you want. But day to day at the ranch, we all 3 work together. Equal stakes, equal say." Eleanor took the paper, recognizing her own signature on the matrimonial agreement. She'd signed it 3 months ago, desperate and frightened after the last church family had suggested she might be happier in the textile mills. The factories paid wages, they'd said. She could support herself. What they meant was, "We're tired of feeding you." "What happens if I say no?" The brothers exchanged a glance she couldn't interpret. Then we take you back to town tomorrow, Jacob said. Give you enough money to wait for the next coach. Send you back east if that's what you want. You'd just let me go. What else would we do? Nathaniel's question sounded genuine. Chain you to the stove. We're not kidding about the lock on your door, Miss Whitmore. You're free to leave any time. The wagon crested a ridge, and suddenly Eleanor could see a valley spread below a thread of creek, cutting through grassland, a cluster of buildings barely visible in the distance, and more open sky than she'd known existed. That's home, Jacob said quietly. The triple S, triple because there's 300 acres. S for stone. Or because it takes 3 people to keep it alive, Nathaniel added. Take your pick of meanings. Eleanor's hands had gone numb from gripping her carpet bag. She forced herself to relax them. If I stayed just hypothetically, what would you expect from me? Cooking, Jacob said. We're both terrible at it. Anything beyond beans and burned meat is an improvement. Help with the horses when we're training them. Not the breaking part that's dangerous, but the gentling after the feeding, the grooming. Garden work. Ma had a vegetable patch that kept us fed 8 months of the year. It's gone to weeds now. Mending clothes. Keeping accounts. Neither of us has Ma's head for numbers. Standing watch sometimes when we're out on the range overnight. They were describing a life of relentless labor. Eleanor had expected that. What she hadn't expected was the absence of anything improper. No mention of bedroom duties or intimate arrangements. Just work, endless work, the kind that broke people down or built them into something stronger. And sleeping arrangements. She forced the question out, her cheeks burning. Told you already, Nathaniel said. Spare room. Your choice of lock or no lock. We sleep in our own rooms on the opposite side of the house. Breakfast is at dawn, Jacob added, as if they were discussing nothing more scandalous than boarding house rules. We're usually out working by first light. Dinner's whenever we finish for the day. Supper's cold leftovers most nights because we're too tired to cook again. The wagon descended into the valley. Details emerged from the distance, a 2-story house badly in need of paint. A barn with new boards patching old ones. Corrals holding perhaps 30 horses, and a windmill creaking in the constant prairie wind. Looks rough, Nathaniel said. We know it. Been spending money on breeding stock instead of appearances. Eleanor saw something else, though. She saw order. The fences were mended. The water troughs were full. The pathway to the house had been cleared of weeds. These men were barely holding on, but they were holding on with both hands, refusing to let their parents' dream collapse into ruin. What happened to your mother's things? Eleanor asked suddenly. Her clothes, her personal items. Jacob turned in the seat. Packed away in the attic. Couldn't bring ourselves to sell them or burn them. Why? Just wondering if you expected me to fill her place or make my own. We expect you to survive, Nathaniel said bluntly. Anything beyond that is bonus. The wagon pulled up to the house. Up close, Eleanor could see the structure was solid despite the peeling paint. 2 stories wide porch windows that still had glass in them. It was practically a mansion compared to the tenement rooms she'd rotated through in Boston. Jacob jumped down and offered his hand. Eleanor hesitated, then took it. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip careful despite obvious strength. I'll show you the house, Jacob said. Nathaniel will handle the horses. I can help with the horses. Both brothers stared at her. You know how to handle horses. Nathaniel's skepticism was obvious. I worked briefly in a stable, just mucking stalls and carrying water, but I learned which end bites and which end kicks. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening of the hard line his mouth had held since town. All right then, you can help. The barn smelled like every barn Eleanor had ever entered, hay and manure and animal warmth, but it was clean. The stalls were mucked, the feed bins organized, the tack hanging neatly on the walls. You keep it tidy, she observed. Ma's rule, Nathaniel said. She used to say chaos in the barn means chaos in the breeding line. We might let the house go to hell, but the barn stays clean. Eleanor helped unhitch the horses, following Nathaniel's curt instructions. He worked with economic precision, no wasted motion, checking each animal's hooves and legs with practiced efficiency. "This is Smoke," he said, patting a gray gelding's neck. "Ma's favorite. 22 years old now, too old for hard work, but we'll never sell him." Eleanor stroked the horse's soft nose. Smoke exhaled warm breath across her palm, and something in her chest loosened slightly. "Your mother loved this place," she said. "More than anything except Pa." Nathaniel's voice roughened. She used to say the ranch was their third child, the one they'd raised together even after Jace and I were grown. Jace. Jacob. I call him that when I'm not annoyed with him. He hoisted a saddle onto its rack with easy strength. You'll probably develop your own system of names depending on mood. Eleanor found herself almost smiling. "Does he call you Nate?" "Only when he wants something." They finished with the horses and walked back to the house. Jacob had lit lamps against the gathering dusk. Inside the house was masculine. That was the only word for it. Functional furniture, clean but sparse, with none of the small touches that made a house feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. "Kitchen's through there," Jacob said, pointing. "We've got a good stove. Ma insisted on buying the best even when money was tight. Pantry's stocked with basics. Water pumps out back, but we usually keep the reservoir filled." He led her upstairs. The hallway was narrow, 4 doors leading off it. "That's Nate's room." Jacob pointed to the first door. "That's mine." The second door. "That's the spare room, yours if you stay." The third door. "And that's the bathing room. We installed plumbing 3 years ago. Hot water takes 20 minutes to heat, but it beats freezing in a creek." The spare room was exactly as described. Small but clean, with a bed covered by a faded quilt in a star pattern. The dresser was solid pine, the mirror above it spotted with age. And yes, the door had a bolt lock on the inside. "Told you," Jacob said softly. "Your space. Your choice." Eleanor set down her carpet bag, then tested the window. It opened smoothly, letting in the evening breeze. "I'll leave you to settle in," Jacob continued. "We'll have cold beef and bread for supper in an hour. You're welcome to join us or eat up here, whatever you prefer." He left, closing the door behind him. Eleanor immediately threw the bolt, then sat heavily on the bed. The mattress was lumpy, but adequate. The quilt smelled faintly of lavender. Someone had tried to keep moths away. She thought about praying, but words wouldn't come. God and she had reached an uncomfortable understanding over the years. She'd stop asking for miracles if he stopped testing her with impossible situations. This definitely qualified as impossible. 2 men, 1 household. A marriage that couldn't exist legally, but apparently functioned practically. She should be horrified. She should be planning her escape. Instead, she found herself thinking about the clean barn and the tidy accounts, and the way both brothers had talked about their mother with voices that still shook with loss. Eleanor unpacked her spare dress and her mother's Bible. She arranged her hairbrush on the dresser. She hung her shawl on the hook by the door. Small acts of claiming space, making it hers. Then she unbolted the door and went downstairs. Both brothers looked up in surprise when she entered the kitchen. "Thought you might want privacy," Jacob said. "I've had enough privacy for one day." Eleanor surveyed the table. Rough-cut bread, cold beef that looked dry, and nothing else. "Is there butter?" "Somewhere," Nathaniel said vaguely. "Vegetables." "Haven't had time for the garden." "Cheese." "Might be some in the cold box out back." Eleanor rolled up her sleeves. "Then I'll make a proper supper. You two set the table correctly. Plates, forks, knives, and napkins." "Yes, napkins. I don't care if you usually eat like animals." She half expected protest. Instead, both brothers moved to obey, exchanging another of those silent communications. The cold box yielded cheese eggs and an onion starting to sprout. The pantry had flour, salt, and lard. In 20 minutes, Eleanor had scrambled eggs with cheese and onion, toasted the bread properly, and created something resembling an edible meal. They ate in silence for several minutes. "Miss Whitmore," Jacob finally said, "this is the best meal we've had in 6 months. It's scrambled eggs." "Exactly." Nathaniel reached for seconds. "We would have burned them." Eleanor felt something dangerous stirring in her chest. Not quite hope, but its malnourished cousin. "Your mother must have been a patient woman. She said teaching us to cook was her life's greatest failure." Jacob smiled at the memory. "Said she'd raised 2 boys who could break horses and mend fences and shoot straight but couldn't boil water without making charcoal." "Sounds accurate," Eleanor said dryly. The conversation drifted into easier territory. Weather horses, the creek's water levels. Eleanor learned that Nathaniel had won 3 horse racing purses last year. Jacob had taught himself carpentry from a book. The ranch's nearest neighbor was Morrison's spread 5 miles south. "Morrison offered to buy us out last month," Nathaniel said, his tone hardening. "Generous offer, he called it, enough to start over somewhere else." "And you refused." "This is our home." The words came from both brothers simultaneously. Then they shared a brief grin at the jinx. After supper, Eleanor insisted on washing dishes. Jacob dried while Nathaniel tended the horses one final time. The domesticity of it felt surreal, standing at a sink, with a stranger who might become her husband discussing whether the plates went in the upper or lower cabinet. "You haven't asked the question everyone asks," Jacob said quietly. "Which question?" "How it would work, between the 3 of us." He set down the dish towel. "Physically, I mean." Eleanor's face burned. "That's none of my business until I decide to stay." "Fair enough." He paused. "But for the record, Ma and Pa kept separate rooms too. She said a woman needed space that was just hers, somewhere she could close the door and breathe. We figured the same rule applies." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." Jacob stared out the dark window. "She also said the right partner feels like coming home, not leaving it. If being here feels like leaving home, Miss Whitmore, then you should go." Eleanor dried her hands slowly. "And if I don't know yet, then you take the time you need to figure it out." She went upstairs, bolted her door, and lay awake for hours. Through the walls, she could hear the brothers moving in their rooms, boots dropping floorboards, creaking, the small sounds of men settling in for the night. She thought about Boston, the orphanage, the succession of families who'd taken her in for charity and worked her for free labor, the textile mill that had been her next option, where girls her age coughed up blood and lost fingers in the machinery. She thought about the prairie sky she'd seen on the ride here, so vast it made her feel microscopic and somehow significant at the same time. She thought about a barn kept clean according to a dead woman's rules, and 2 men who still couldn't cook properly despite 6 years of trying. Eleanor didn't sleep. But by dawn, when she heard the brothers stirring downstairs, she'd made her decision. She found them in the kitchen, attempting coffee with grim determination. "I'll stay," Eleanor said without preamble. 1-month trial. No legal marriage yet. I'll work, you'll pay me wages, same as any hired hand, and at the end of 30 days, we decide together if this arrangement can work. Jacob set down the coffee pot. Wages weren't part of the matrimonial contract. The matrimonial contract was written under false pretenses. "These are my terms." Eleanor crossed her arms. $20 a month, same as you'd pay a decent ranch hand, plus room and board. If we all agree at the end of the month that this partnership functions, then we talk about legal marriage. If not, you give me passage money back east and a reference letter." "Agreed." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, then stuck out his hand. "Agreed." They shook on it first, Nathaniel, then Jacob. Eleanor felt the roughness of their palms, the strength held carefully in check, and wondered if she'd just made the wisest or most foolish decision of her life. "Good," she said briskly. "Now get out of my kitchen. You two are burning the coffee." The first week passed in a blur of endless work that left Eleanor's hands raw and her muscles screaming. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, spent mornings in the garden, wrestling weeds from soil gone hard as brick afternoons mending fences, or helping with the horses, and evenings cooking meals that the brothers devoured like starving men. Which she realized by day 3, they essentially were. "How have you survived this long?" Eleanor demanded on the 5th morning, staring at their pantry inventory. "You have flour, salt, lard, and dried beans. That's it. Where's the sugar? The preserves? The spices?" Jacob looked genuinely confused. "We eat what we need to keep working." "You eat like prisoners, not ranchers." Eleanor added items to her list with sharp pencil strokes. "I'm going to town today for proper supplies." "Town's 3 hours round trip," Nathaniel said. "We need you here." "You need me healthy, which means I need vegetables that aren't fossilized and meat that's been salted this decade." Eleanor grabbed her shawl. "I'll take the wagon. Give me a list of anything else you need." The brothers exchanged that wordless communication she was beginning to recognize entire conversations happening in seconds through eye contact alone. "Fine," Nathaniel finally said. "But take the rifle." Morrison's hands sometimes used the town road. Eleanor had never fired a rifle in her life. She didn't admit this. Instead, she loaded the weapon into the wagon alongside her shopping list and her carefully hoarded wages and drove herself to Redemption Ridge with her spine straight and her hands steady on the reins. The town looked different in full daylight without 2 towering cowboys flanking her. Smaller, less threatening. She hitched the wagon outside the general store and walked in with her chin up, daring anyone to comment. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, stood at the counter. She turned when Eleanor entered, and her eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said, "the Stone Boy's bride. Didn't think we'd see you again. Thought you'd run screaming back east by now." Eleanor set her basket on the counter. "I need flour, sugar, dried fruit, coffee beans, salt pork, and whatever vegetables you have that aren't actively rotting. That's a long list for a woman who might not stay. That's a long list for a household that's been starving itself." Eleanor met the older woman's eyes without flinching. "Do you have these items or not?" Something shifted in Mrs. Henderson's expression. Not quite approval, but a grudging respect. "Got everything except the dried fruit. Shipments delayed. Can offer you preserves instead. Made them myself last summer." "How much?" 4 jars for $1. It was highway robbery. Eleanor knew it, and Mrs. Henderson knew she knew it. But the alternative was another week of watching the brothers eat beans and burnt meat, their faces hollowing from inadequate nutrition. Done. While Mrs. Henderson gathered items, 2 other women entered the store. Eleanor recognized them from that first-day members of the watching crowd. They whispered to each other not quite quietly enough. "Shameful if you ask me. 2 men and 1 woman under the same roof." "Well, nobody did ask you, Martha. Maybe the girls got more sense than we credit. Those boys have good land." "Good land doesn't make up for bad morals." Eleanor's hands tightened on her basket handle. She'd heard similar whispers her entire life about her mother who'd died unwed. About Eleanor herself, the bastard orphan. About every choice she'd ever made that didn't fit into someone else's narrow definition of acceptable. She turned slowly. "Excuse me, but were you speaking to me or just about me?" Martha flushed red. The second woman, Eleanor didn't know her name, smiled slightly. "Just making observations," Martha said stiffly. "Then observe this." Eleanor's voice stayed level, despite the anger thrumming through her veins. "The Stone brothers work harder than any 2 men I've ever seen. They're trying to keep their parents' legacy alive despite drought isolation and neighbors who'd rather gossip than help. If you find that shameful, the problem isn't with them or me. It's with you." She turned back to the counter where Mrs. Henderson was wrapping her purchases, fighting to keep her hands from shaking. She'd never spoken back to respectable women before. In Boston, that kind of defiance got you expelled from church charity, cut off from assistants left to starve, or worse. That's $23 even, Mrs. Henderson said, then lowered her voice. And that was well said, girl. Martha's been needing someone to tell her to mind her own business for 20 years. Eleanor paid, loaded her supplies, and drove back to the S with her heart still pounding. She'd defended the brothers, defended herself, defended a living arrangement that she still wasn't certain about. The realization left her dizzy. Nathaniel was working a young horse in the corral when she returned. He tied off the animal and came to help unload, his eyes scanning her face. Trouble in town. Nothing I couldn't handle. Eleanor passed him a crate of supplies, though apparently were the subject of extensive moral speculation. His jaw tightened. People talk. Always have, always will. You all right? I told Martha, whoever she is, that her problem was with herself, not with us. Eleanor heard the word "leave her mouth us" and felt its weight. 5 days ago, there was no us. Now apparently there was. Nathaniel's expression shifted into something that might have been pride. Good. Ma used to say half the women in this territory spent so much time judging others, they forgot to live their own lives. They carried supplies inside where Jacob was attempting to fix a door hinge. He looked up when they entered, and Eleanor saw the question in his eyes before he asked it. Town go all right? Martha thinks we're shameful, Eleanor reported. Mrs. Henderson thinks Martha needs to mind her business. I bought preserves at extortionate prices. It was a productive trip. Jacob's slow smile was worth the entire confrontation. You're tougher than you look, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor, she corrected. If we're going to work together, you might as well use my given name. Eleanor, then. Jacob tested the word. And you should call us Jace and Nate. Formal names don't make much sense when you're elbow deep in dishwater together. That night, Eleanor used the preserves to make something approximating a proper dessert. The brothers stared at their plates like she'd performed a miracle. What is this? Nate asked. Bread pudding with preserves. It's not fancy, but it's sweet, and it'll stick to your ribs. Jace took a bite, closed his eyes, and made a sound that was almost indecent. Eleanor, if you leave after 30 days, I'm going to cry like a baby. Grown men don't cry over dessert. Grown men who've been eating beans for 6 months absolutely do. He took another bite. I'd forgotten food could taste good instead of just functional. Eleanor felt that dangerous warmth in her chest again, not quite belonging, but something adjacent to it. She was useful here, needed. The brothers weren't being kind out of charity. They genuinely required her skills. It was more respect than she'd received in 23 years of life. The second week brought harder tests. A fence section collapsed in the north pasture, requiring all 3 of them to spend 2 days repairing it under a sun that felt like it was trying to murder them personally. Eleanor learned to dig post holes, tamp earth string wire tight enough to sing. Her hands blistered, then bled, then calloused. You don't have to do this, Jace said, watching her wrap torn palms in strips of cloth. Fence work isn't in the contract. Neither is starving yourselves, but you manage that just fine. Eleanor tested the bandages. If this ranch needs 3 people, then I'm one of the 3. That means I do the work. Nate, who'd been watching silently, nodded once. It was the closest thing to approval she'd gotten from him, and it mattered more than she wanted to admit. But the ranch work was only part of the test. The real challenge came from Morrison. Eleanor first met him on her second trip to town, 3 weeks into her trial period. She was loading supplies when a man approached, older than the brothers, probably 45, wearing clothes that cost more than her entire wardrobe. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. You must be the Stone Boys' mail-order bride? Eleanor, isn't it? She didn't correct him about the trial arrangement. And you are Rishi, Richard Morrison. I own the Double M spread south of the S. He leaned against her wagon with presumed familiarity. Heard you've been settling in. Must be quite an adjustment coming from back east to this rough country. I'm managing. I'm sure you are. You seem like a capable woman. His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Too capable to waste yourself on a failing ranch if you ask me. Nobody asked you. Morrison's smile didn't waver. The Stone boys are proud, I'll give them that. But pride doesn't pay bills. That ranch is bleeding money. The horses aren't selling the lands too dry for good grazing, and they're one bad season away from losing everything their parents built. Eleanor kept loading supplies, refusing to show interest. But her stomach clenched. Was he telling the truth? The brothers hadn't discussed finances beyond her wages, and she hadn't asked. Maybe she should have. Now I've made them a generous offer, Morrison continued. Enough money to start fresh somewhere with better prospects, but they won't even consider it. You know why? Because it's their home. Because they're stubborn fools, letting sentiment cloud judgment. He shifted closer. A smart woman in your position might convince them to see reason. Help them accept reality before they lose everything anyway. I'd make it worth your while, finder's fee, let's call it. Eleanor set down the flour sack and faced him fully. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to say this once. I'm not interested in your money, your offer, or your opinions about the Stones' choices. Now please step away from my wagon. His expression hardened. You think those boys can protect you, keep you fed and clothed and safe? They can't even keep themselves afloat. That's their business, not yours, and definitely not yours to discuss with me. She climbed onto the wagon seat, but Morrison grabbed the horse's bridle. You're making a mistake, Miss Whitmore. When that ranch fails, and it will fail, don't come crying to me for help. Eleanor picked up the rifle she'd started carrying. She didn't aim it, just rested it across her lap meaningfully. Let go of my horse. Morrison released the bridle hands raised in mock surrender. Just trying to be neighborly. You'll learn soon enough. She drove away with her spine rigid and her hands shaking. The encounter left her unsettled for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. Morrison's words had burrowed under her skin like splinters failing ranch bleeding money, one bad season away from losing everything. That evening, after supper, she asked the question she'd been avoiding. How bad are the finances really? Both brothers looked up from their coffee. Jace and Nate exchanged that silent communication. Then Jace sighed. Bad enough. We've got money to get through this year if nothing catastrophic happens. But the horses aren't selling like we'd hoped. Drought's making grazing scarce. We're holding on, but it's tight. Morrison approached me in town today. Said you'd be better off selling to him. Nate's expression went dark. Morrison's been circling like a vulture since Ma died. He wants our creek access, his land's drier than ours. He'll say anything to get us to sell. Is he right, though? About the ranch failing? No. Jace's voice was firm. We're struggling, but we're not failing. There's a difference. We've got breeding stock that'll pay off next year when the colts are ready to sell. The garden you've been resurrecting will cut food costs. We're going to make it. Unless something catastrophic happens, Eleanor said quietly. Unless that, yes. Jace met her eyes. But life doesn't come with guarantees, Eleanor. We could sell to Morrison and lose all that money in a bad investment somewhere else. At least here we're fighting for something that matters. Eleanor understood that logic. She'd been fighting for survival her entire life, never certain if the next day would bring opportunity or disaster. But at least she'd been fighting for herself. These men were fighting for a dream that belonged to their dead parents. Does Morrison have reason to sabotage you? She asked. To make that catastrophe happen himself? The brothers went very still. What did he say to you? Nate's voice was quiet, dangerous. Nothing specific, just the way he spoke about the ranch failing. Like he was certain of it. Like maybe he'd help it along. Jace stood abruptly. We've had problems. Fences cut in places where animals got out. A barn fire last year that we thought was accident but never could prove. If Morrison's been behind it. We can't prove anything, Nate interrupted. And accusing a man like Morrison without proof just makes us look desperate. So we do nothing. We stay vigilant. We protect what's ours. Nate looked at Eleanor. And we make sure you're never alone anywhere Morrison might find you. He approached you once, he'll do it again. Eleanor wanted to argue that she could handle herself, but the memory of Morrison's cold eyes and calculated words made her hold her tongue. There were different kinds of danger in the world, and she was smart enough to recognize when she'd encountered one. The fourth week brought the catastrophe they'd feared. Eleanor woke to shouting. She threw on her wrapper and ran downstairs to find both brothers pulling on boots, their faces grim in the lamplight. "What's happened?" "Northern fence is down," Jace said. "All the horses are loose. We can hear them running. Someone cut the fence, Eleanor. This wasn't accident or weather." Her blood went cold. "Morrison." "Can't prove it, but yes, probably Morrison." Nate grabbed a coil of rope. "We'll be gone most of the day rounding them up. Can you handle things here?" "Of course. But lock the doors after we leave. Don't open them for anyone except us. There's a pistol in the kitchen drawer. Do you know how to fire it?" Eleanor shook her head. Jace pulled the weapon out, checked it quickly. "Point pull trigger. It kicks hard, so brace yourself. Don't fire unless you have no other choice, but if that choice comes, don't hesitate. Understand?" She nodded, throat too tight for words. The brothers left in the pre-dawn darkness. Eleanor stood at the window watching their lanterns fade into the prairie, feeling more alone than she'd felt since arriving. She made coffee she couldn't drink, started bread she couldn't focus on, and checked the locks 3 times. The knock came at mid-morning. Eleanor approached the door slowly, pistol heavy in her hand. "Who's there?" "Mrs. Henderson from town. I've brought supplies you ordered." Eleanor hadn't ordered anything. Her hand tightened on the pistol grip. "Leave them on the porch, please. They're heavy. I need help unloading." Every instinct Eleanor had developed over years of surviving dangerous situations screamed warning. Mrs. Henderson was 65 years old and arthritic. She wouldn't drive supplies out personally, and she certainly wouldn't ask for help unloading. "I'll get them later. Thank you for coming." Silence. Then a man's voice, Morrison's voice. "Smart girl. Knew you weren't stupid." Eleanor's heart hammered. "What do you want?" "Just to talk about your future with those boys. About what happens when they lose this ranch." "Go away." "Or what? You'll shoot me through the door. That'd be murder, Miss Whitmore. Even in Wyoming territory, we hang women for that." Eleanor backed away from the door, watching for movement at the windows. Morrison was right, she couldn't shoot him without cause. But she also couldn't open the door. "The Stone brothers will be back soon," she called out, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Not for hours. Those horses scattered to hell and gone. Takes time to round up 30 panicked animals." Morrison's footsteps creaked on the porch. "I'm not here to hurt you, girl. Just to offer you a choice." "I've already made my choice." "You chose poverty. Struggle. Watching those boys work themselves to death trying to save something that's already lost." His shadow passed across a window. "I'm offering you a way out. Convince them to sell, and I'll pay you $500. That's more money than you've seen in your life. Enough to go anywhere, start over, marry well." $500. Eleanor's mind reeled. That was freedom, security, everything she'd never had. "Why would you pay me to convince them?" "Because they trust you now. You've got influence they don't realize yet. And because I'm tired of waiting." Morrison's voice hardened. "This ranch will be mine one way or another, Miss Whitmore. Either they sell peacefully, or I'll keep pushing until they break. The fence last night was just the beginning. Next time maybe the barn burns, or the house, or maybe someone gets hurt out on the range too far from help." Eleanor's hands went numb. "You're threatening them." "I'm stating facts. Accidents happen on ranches all the time. Everyone knows that." She thought about Jace's slow smile when she'd made bread pudding, Nate's grudging respect after she'd defended herself in town, the way both brothers still honored their mother's rules about barn cleanliness and locked doors, the careful way they'd given her space-time choice. "No," Eleanor said clearly. "No what? No to your offer. No to betraying them. No to any part of whatever scheme you're running." She raised the pistol, even though he couldn't see it, needing to feel its weight. "And if you set foot on this property again, I'll shoot you and claim self-defense. A woman alone, a strange man trespassing every court in the territory would believe me. Morrison's laugh was ugly. You've got more spine than sense, girl. But spine breaks eventually. Remember that when things get worse. His footsteps retreated. Eleanor stood frozen until she heard a horse leave at a gallop. Then, she sank to the floor, pistol still clutched in shaking hands, and let herself breathe. The brothers returned at sunset, exhausted and filthy, leading a string of recovered horses. Eleanor met them in the yard, words tumbling out before they'd even dismounted. Morrison came here. He tried to bribe me to convince you to sell. He admitted to cutting the fence. He's threatening worse if you don't give in. Both men went utterly still. He was here. Jace's voice was deadly quiet. You were alone, and he came here. I didn't open the door. I had the pistol. I told him I'd shoot him if he came back. Eleanor realized she was babbling, shock finally catching up to her. He offered me $500. $500 to betray you. Nate swung down from his horse and pulled her into a brief, hard hug. Eleanor stiffened in surprise. It was the first time either brother had touched her beyond helping her up or down from the wagon. You did good, he said roughly. You're safe, that's what matters. Jace's expression was colder than she'd ever seen it. This ends now. We ride to town tomorrow and file a complaint with the territorial marshal. Morrison's gone too far. You can't prove anything, Eleanor said, echoing Nate's earlier words. It's my word against his. Who will they believe, the desperate bride or the successful rancher? Then we find proof, Jace said. We set watches. We document everything. We be smart, Nate interrupted. Morrison wants us angry and reckless, wants us to make mistakes. We don't give him that satisfaction. Eleanor watched emotions war on Jace's face before he nodded slowly. Fine, but she's not alone here again. Not ever. One of us stays with the house at all times. That's not practical, Eleanor protested. You need both pairs of hands for the work. Not as much as we need you alive and safe. Nate's tone left no room for argument. This isn't negotiable, Eleanor. She realized something then, standing in the dusty yard with two exhausted men who'd just spent all day fixing her enemy's sabotage. They weren't protecting property or partnership arrangements. They were protecting her. Not because she was useful or convenient, but because somewhere in the last 4 weeks she'd become someone they cared about. The feeling was mutual, terrifying, and completely unplanned. All right, she said quietly. No more being alone. But that means we work as a 3-person unit from now on. No more dividing tasks. We stay together, we work together, we face Morrison together. The brothers nodded. In the fading light, their faces looked carved from stone, determined, dangerous, and utterly committed. That night, after the horses were settled and supper finished, Eleanor found herself in the kitchen with Jace, while Nate did a final perimeter check. They washed dishes in companionable silence until Jace spoke. You could have taken Morrison's offer. $500 would set you up for life. I'm aware. So why didn't you? Eleanor dried a plate, carefully thinking about her answer. Because you and Nate trusted me. You gave me a locked door, fair wages, and treated me like a partner instead of property. That's worth more than Morrison's blood money. Jace's hands stilled in the wash water. You're not thinking of leaving when the month ends, are you? No. The word came out with certainty that surprised her. If you'll have me, I'd like to stay. Legally this time. Marriage and everything that comes with it. Everything. Eleanor met his eyes. I'm saying I choose this. The ranch, the work, both of you. All of it. But we do it right. Marriage certificate, public declaration. No more wondering if I'm staying or going. Jace dried his hands slowly. You realize what you're agreeing to, what people will say, what it'll mean. People already talk. They'll talk regardless. I'd rather give them something true to gossip about than live my life worried about their opinions. Eleanor hung up the dish towel. Besides, your mother managed 30 years with 2 stubborn stone men. Figure I can at least try." Jace's laugh was startled and genuine. "She'd have liked you. Would have said you've got good sense buried under all that Eastern propriety." "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes. But we ask Nate too. This is all 3 of us, or none of us." Nate returned from his patrol to find them waiting at the kitchen table. Jace explained Eleanor's proposal in his typical straightforward manner, leaving nothing out. Nate listened without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable. When Jace finished, silence stretched long enough to make Eleanor's stomach knot. "You're sure?" Nate finally asked, looking at Eleanor. "Not deciding because Morrison scared you. Not staying because you've got nowhere else to go." "I'm staying because this is where I want to be." Eleanor held his gaze. "I choose this ranch. I choose this life. I choose both of you. Is that clear enough?" Nate's slow smile was worth every terrifying moment of the day. "Clear as creek water after rain. Welcome home, Eleanor Stone." They rode to town the next morning, all 3 of them together, and stood before the territorial judge to register a marriage between Eleanor Whitmore and Jacob Stone. The brothers explained the arrangement honestly. 1 legal marriage, 3 partners in the ranch, equal stakes for everyone. The judge, a leathery man named Hendricks, who'd seen everything in 40 years of frontier law, stamped the papers without comment. "You're legal now. The Triple S belongs to all of you equally, regardless of whose name is on which document. That's how I'm recording it." He looked at Eleanor over his spectacles. "Morrison comes sniffing around with legal trouble, you tell him Judge Hendricks says to take a long walk off a short cliff." Outside the courthouse, dust and light blurred together. Eleanor stood between Jace and Nate, aware of curious eyes from every direction. She'd expected judgment. Instead, she saw mostly indifference, people too busy with their own struggles to care about her unconventional choices. Martha stood outside the general store, lips pressed into a disapproving line. Eleanor met her stare calmly and nodded once, as if to say, "Yes, I did exactly what you're thinking, and I'm not apologizing." Mrs. Henderson emerged from her boarding house and approached them directly. "Well, congratulations are in order, I suppose." "Thank you," Eleanor said cautiously. "Don't thank me yet. I'm about to give you advice you didn't ask for." Mrs. Henderson crossed her arms. "Morrison's going to push harder now. You've taken his easy option off the table. Men like him don't handle that well." "We'll manage." "See that you do. And Eleanor—" The older woman's expression softened slightly. "Your mother-in-law was the finest woman I knew. You wear her name well. Don't let anyone tell you different." The validation, unexpected and unearned, made Eleanor's eyes sting. "I'll do my best to honor it." They drove back to the Triple S with the marriage certificate secured in Eleanor's bag, and a sense of permanence settling over all of them. This wasn't a trial period anymore. This was commitment, messy, unconventional, and entirely theirs. Morrison didn't wait long to respond. 3 nights later, Nate spotted smoke rising from the eastern pasture. They rode out together, Eleanor included, to find fire crawling through dry grass toward the barn where their breeding stock sheltered. They fought the fire for hours, beating flames with wet blankets, digging fire breaks with desperate efficiency, moving terrified horses to safer ground. By dawn, they'd saved the barn, but lost 20 acres of grazing land and came so close to catastrophe that Eleanor's hands still shook. "We can't prove this was Morrison," Jace said, staring at the scorched earth. "Don't need to prove it," Nate replied grimly. "We all know. Question is what we do about it." Eleanor, covered in soot and exhausted, made a decision. "We document everything. Every fence cut, every fire, every threat. We build a case so strong that when Morrison finally crosses the line into something undeniable, we have everything ready for the marshal." "That could take months," Jace protested. "Then it takes months. But we don't give him what he wants. We don't break, we don't sell, and we don't back down." Eleanor looked at both brothers. "We chose this together. Now we defend it together." In the ash-stained morning light, Three people who'd started as strangers stood as something much more complicated and profound, a family forged by choice, not blood. Morrison could burn their pastures and cut their fences. He could threaten and bribe and sabotage. But he couldn't break what they'd built from honesty, labor, and the simple revolutionary act of choosing each other against all conventional wisdom. Eleanor had come west expecting security. Instead, she'd found something far more dangerous and valuable. She'd found home. The documentation started that same morning while the smell of smoke still clung to their clothes. Eleanor created a ledger with 3 columns: date, incident, and evidence. The first entries made for grim reading. August 15th, northern fence cut, 30 horses scattered. August 18th, fire in eastern pasture, 20 acres burned. Each line represented hours of lost work, thousands of dollars in potential damage, and Morrison's escalating campaign to drive them off their land. "We need witnesses," Eleanor said, reviewing what they'd written. "Morrison's smart enough not to get caught himself. He's using his ranch hands to do the dirty work." "No one's going to testify against Morrison," Jace said. "He employs half the men in this county. They'd lose their jobs." "Then we catch someone in the act." Nate sharpened his knife with methodical strokes. "We set watches at night patrol in shifts. Eventually, Morrison's people will make a mistake." Eleanor added another item to her list. "And we make friends. Build alliances with other ranchers, townspeople, anyone who might stand with us when this comes to a head." "Most folks won't risk crossing Morrison," Jace warned. "Most isn't all. We only need a few good people willing to tell the truth." Eleanor closed the ledger with a sense of purpose that felt almost like hope. "Your mother managed to build this ranch from nothing. We can defend it." The weeks that followed established a new rhythm at the Triple S. They worked in tight formation now, never separating by more than shouting distance. Eleanor learned to watch for movement in the tall grass while helping with the horses. Jason Nate taught her to read the land, where tracks showed recent passage, where fence wire looked cleanly cut, instead of broken by weather, where trouble might hide in the creases of the valley. She also learned to shoot. Nate set up targets behind the barn and stood behind her, while she fought the rifle's kick, her ears ringing from the percussion. "Breathe out slow," he instructed. "Squeeze the trigger, don't pull, again." Eleanor fired, misfired again. The 5th shot finally hit the target, not the center, but close enough to matter. "Good," Nate said, and the single word of praise warmed her more than it should have. "You won't win any competitions, but you'll hit what you're aiming at if you need to." "I hope I never need to. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. That's what Ma always said." They talked about their mother often, Eleanor noticed. The brothers kept her memory alive through small rituals, maintaining her garden rules, using her recipes, fixing things the way she'd taught them. Eleanor found herself adding to those traditions, discovering which practices honored the past, and which ones needed updating for their changed circumstances. "Ma wouldn't have tolerated this coffee," Eleanor announced one morning, dumping out the burnt pot Jace had attempted. "You two are going to learn to make it properly or die trying." "We've survived this long," Jace protested. "Survived isn't the same as lived. Watch carefully." She demonstrated the correct proportions, the right temperature, the necessary patience. Both brothers watched with the intense focus they usually reserved for gentling, difficult horses. By the end of the week, they could produce drinkable coffee. By the end of the month, they could make it almost as well as Eleanor. "Ma tried for years to teach us kitchen skills," Nate admitted, pouring 3 cups of their collaborative brew. "We never paid attention because she was always there to do it right." "And then she wasn't," Eleanor said quietly. "And then she wasn't," Jace agreed. "We should have learned when we had the chance." Eleanor touched his hand briefly. "You're learning now. That's what matters." These small moments of domesticity wove between the larger tension of Morrison's ongoing threat. 2 more fences were cut. A water trough was poisoned, sickening 3 horses before they caught it. Someone scattered caltrops across the main trail, nearly laming Jace's mount. Each incident went into the ledger with cold precision, building a record that Morrison didn't know existed. Eleanor made good on her promise to build alliances. She started by befriending Sarah Chen, who ran the town's small restaurant with her husband. Sarah was practical, sharp-eyed, and had no patience for Morrison's inflated sense of importance. "That man thinks his money makes him king," Sarah said, pouring Eleanor tea in the restaurant's back room. "But kings fall when enough people decide they're tired of bowing. Would you testify if it came to that?" "About things you've seen or heard," Sarah considered carefully. "Morrison's never bothered me directly. My husband and I keep our heads down, serve good food, don't make waves. But if you're asking whether I'd tell the truth if asked directly, yes, I would." "That's all I need to know." Eleanor squeezed Sarah's hand. "Thank you." She collected similar promises from the blacksmith's wife from a young ranch hand who'd been fired by Morrison for objecting to mistreating horses from Mrs. Henderson, who'd watched Morrison's manipulations for 2 decades. None of them would volunteer testimony, but all of them would speak truthfully if circumstances demanded it. "You're building an army," Jace observed after Eleanor returned from another trip to town. "I'm building insurance," Eleanor corrected. "Morrison thinks we're isolated and vulnerable. He needs to learn we have more support than he realizes." But Morrison was building his own case. Eleanor learned this from an unexpected source, Morrison's own wife. Catherine Morrison appeared at the Triple S on a cool September morning driving a buggy without her usual escort. Eleanor saw her coming from the kitchen window and called for the brothers, uncertain whether this was threat or something else entirely. Catherine climbed down from the buggy with stiff dignity. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with eyes that had seen too much and said too little. "Mrs. Stone," she said formally, "I'd like to speak with you. Alone if possible." Eleanor glanced at Jace and Nate, who hovered protectively. "It's all right. We'll talk on the porch where you can see us." They sat in the rockers that had belonged to the brothers' parents. Catherine arranged her skirts precisely before speaking. "My husband is planning something." Her voice was steady, rehearsed. "I don't know all the details, but I know it involves framing your family for something serious. Theft or assault, I believe. He's been meeting with the territorial marshal, laying groundwork, building a narrative." Eleanor's blood chilled. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm tired." Catherine's composure cracked slightly. "Tired of watching my husband destroy good people to satisfy his greed. Tired of pretending I don't see what he does. Tired of being complicit through silence. If he finds out you warned us, then I'll deal with those consequences. I'm not asking for gratitude or friendship, Mrs. Stone. I'm simply doing what I should have done years ago, telling the truth." Eleanor studied the older woman's face, reading decades of carefully swallowed objections and buried principles. "What specifically is he planning?" "He's going to claim your family stole his cattle. He's already moved some of his herd onto your land. I heard him giving the orders. When they're found there, he'll accuse you of rustling. The marshal will have to investigate. With Richard's testimony and the physical evidence, the case will seem solid." "But we haven't stolen anything." "I know. But perception becomes reality in frontier justice. By the time you prove your innocence, your reputation will be destroyed. The ranch will be forfeit to pay legal fees and restitution, and Richard will buy it for pennies on the dollar, exactly as he's planned." Eleanor's mind raced through implications and countermoves. When is this happening? Soon, perhaps days. He's waiting for the right moment to maximize impact. Catherine stood smoothing her skirts with shaking hands. "I should go before someone sees me here." "Mrs. Morrison." Eleanor stood as well. "Thank you. Whatever your reasons, you may have saved everything we've built. Then perhaps this one act will balance the scales of all the times I stayed silent." Catherine's smile was bitter and sad. "Be careful, Mrs. Stone. My husband is dangerous when crossed, and you've crossed him thoroughly." Eleanor watched her drive away, then turned to find both brothers standing in the doorway. "You heard?" she asked. Every word, Nate confirmed grimly. Morrison's escalating faster than we thought. We need to move first, Jace said. Find those cattle before he can spring his trap. Document their presence on our land. Prove they were put there deliberately. They spent the rest of the day searching their property, riding in careful patterns across 300 acres. They found Morrison's cattle in the North Valley, 15 head, bearing the Double M brand enclosed by a hastily erected temporary fence that made it look like the Triple S had been holding them. Smart, Nate said, examining the fence work. If we move them back to his land, he claims we're trying to hide evidence of theft. If we leave them here, he calls the marshal and we look guilty. Eleanor circled the area, slowly thinking. We don't move them. We document everything exactly as it is. Photographs if we can get them. Then we invite the marshal out ourselves before Morrison has a chance to. That's risky, Jace warned. We're gambling on the marshal being honest. We're gambling on having more proof than Morrison expects. Eleanor gestured to the sloppy fence work. Look at this. Fresh lumber, hasty construction positioned to look like we built it, but done poorly on purpose. Morrison's people got careless. They left evidence of their own guilt. They photographed everything, Eleanor carefully noting distances, angles, and details in her ledger. Then they rode to town and walked straight into the marshal's office. Marshal Tom Bridger was 60 years old, weathered by 4 decades of frontier law enforcement, and possessed eyes that had seen every type of crime and criminal. He listened to their story without interrupting, examining their photographs and documentation with careful attention. You're saying Morrison put his own cattle on your land to frame you for rustling, Bridger summarized. That's a serious accusation. Yes, sir, Eleanor said, and we have proof. You have suspicious circumstances. Proof requires more. But Bridger's tone suggested he wasn't dismissing them. Still, if what you're saying is true, Morrison's committed fraud and conspiracy. I'll need to investigate thoroughly. We're asking you to, Jace said, before Morrison comes to you with his version of events. Bridger leaned back in his chair, studying all 3 of them. I've known Richard Morrison for 20 years, known him to be ambitious, ruthless when it suits him, and not particularly concerned with honesty. I've also had suspicions I could never prove. He tapped the photographs. This might be the opening I've needed. So you'll investigate, Eleanor pressed. I'll examine the site myself tomorrow morning. I'll bring a deputy as witness. If the evidence supports your claims, I'll be asking Morrison some very hard questions. Bridger's expression hardened. But understand this, if you're lying to me, if this is some scheme to damage Morrison's reputation, I'll see all 3 of you in jail. Clear? Crystal clear, Eleanor said. We're telling the truth. They left the marshal's office with a mixture of relief and anxiety. They'd made their move, but now everything depended on Bridger's integrity and Morrison's reaction. Morrison's reaction came faster than expected. That night, Eleanor woke to shouting. She grabbed her wrapper and the pistol she now kept by her bed, running downstairs to find both brothers at the window, rifles ready. Someone's out there, Nate said quietly. Multiple riders. Could be Morrison's men, or could be something worse. A voice called from the darkness. Stone. We know you're in there. Come out peaceful and nobody gets hurt. Eleanor's stomach dropped. That sounds like a posse. That's because it is. Jace's jaw tightened. Morrison moved faster than we thought. He went to the marshal before we could prove our case. But Eleanor remembered Bridger's careful attention, his admission of long-held suspicions. Or he went to the marshal and found the marshal wasn't cooperative. So he's taking matters into his own hands. Another shout. You've got 1 minute to surrender, then we're coming in. Nate checked his rifle. We can defend this house if we have to. It's solid construction, good sight lines. We're not starting a gunfight, Eleanor interrupted. Her mind raced through scenarios, calculating angles and outcomes with the survival instinct that had kept her alive through 23 hard years. If we fight, we're outlaws no matter what the truth is. We need to be smarter than that. Then what do you suggest? Jace demanded. Walk out there and let Morrison's thugs take us. We walk out there and demand to know by what authority they're here." Eleanor set down her pistol and lit a lamp. "We make them state their business in the open, where their words matter." She opened the door before either brother could stop her, standing in the threshold with lamplight behind her and darkness ahead. 8 men on horseback formed a semicircle in the yard. Morrison sat at the center, but she also recognized the deputy who worked under Marshal Bridger. "Good evening, gentlemen." Eleanor called out, her voice carrying across the space with a calmness she didn't feel. "To what do we owe this midnight visit?" Morrison urged his horse forward. "Don't play innocent, Mrs. Stone. You've been caught rustling. The marshal's coming at dawn to arrest you and your husbands. We're here to make sure you don't run." "The marshal asked you to detain us. The marshal will do his duty once he sees the evidence. Then I'm sure he'll also investigate how your cattle came to be on our land in the first place." Eleanor let that statement hang in the air. "Because we've already documented everything. The fresh fence work, the deliberate placement, the timing that's just a bit too convenient." Morrison's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or might have been rage. "You're accusing me of framing you. I'm observing facts and drawing logical conclusions." Eleanor took a step onto the porch, aware of Jace and Nate flanking her. "Your cattle, our land. Evidence that we reported first before you could spring whatever trap you'd planned. The marshal is aware of all this. So I ask again, by what authority are you here?" The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Morrison said—" "Mr. Morrison isn't the law," Eleanor interrupted. "Marshal Bridger is. And unless you have a warrant signed by a judge, you're trespassing on private property with armed men in the middle of the night. That seems more like a criminal act than a legal one." She was gambling everything on Bridger's integrity, betting that the marshal had refused Morrison's pressure and that Morrison had come here without legal backing. The deputy's continued discomfort suggested she'd guessed correctly. "We're not leaving until the marshal arrives," Morrison said. "If you're innocent, you've got nothing to worry about. Then you can wait at the property line, not in our yard." Nate's voice was cold steel. "You've got no right to be here, Morrison. You know it, we know it, and your deputy knows it." The deputy cleared his throat. "Actually, Mr. Morrison, if they're not resisting arrest and there's no immediate danger, protocol says we should maintain position at a reasonable distance until the marshal arrives with proper authority." Morrison rounded on him. "I'm paying you to—" "You're not paying me, sir. The territory is. And I take my orders from Marshal Bridger." The deputy touched his hat brim toward Eleanor. "Ma'am, if you'll agree to remain on your property until the marshal arrives to sort this out, we'll withdraw to the road." "You have my word," Eleanor said. "We'll be right here when Marshal Bridger comes. We've got nothing to hide." Morrison's face had gone purple with fury, but he couldn't argue without admitting he had no legal standing. He wheeled his horse around and led his men toward the property line, throwing back one final threat. "You think you're clever, Mrs. Stone, but cleverness won't save you. The marshal will see the truth come morning." "I'm counting on it," Eleanor called back. When they'd gone, she sagged against the porch post. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. Jace caught her elbow. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen," he said. "Probably both." Eleanor forced herself upright. "But it worked. Morrison came here without legal authority, which means he's worried. Worried people make mistakes." "He made a mistake showing up at all," Nate added. "Now we've got witnesses to him trying to intimidate us before the marshal's official investigation." They didn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, they sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and watching the eastern sky gradually lighten, waiting for whatever morning would bring. Marshal Bridger arrived at dawn with 2 deputies, proper documentation, and a grim expression. He examined the cattle, the fence work, and the surrounding area with methodical thoroughness. Morrison and his men watched from the property line, unable to interfere without revealing their own involvement. After 2 hours, Bridger returned to the house where Eleanor and the brothers waited. "Mrs. Stone, I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Morrison came to me yesterday afternoon, claiming you'd stolen his cattle. I told him I'd investigate this morning. I didn't authorize him to come out here last night with a mob." "We assumed as much," Eleanor said. "What did you find?" "Fence work that's less than a week old, poorly constructed by someone who knew it needed to look hasty. Fresh cattle tracks leading from Morrison's land to yours with several animals, showing signs of stress consistent with forced movement. And boot prints near the fence that don't match any of your footwear." Bridger pulled out a notebook. "I'm no detective, but this looks like someone moved cattle onto your property deliberately and recently." "That's because someone did," Eleanor said. "Morrison's been trying to force us off our land for months. This was his latest attempt." Bridger nodded slowly. "I'm going to need detailed statements from all three of you. Every incident, every threat, everything you've documented. If Morrison's been running a campaign of harassment, I want it on official record." They spent the morning providing testimony while Bridger's deputies took notes. Eleanor produced her ledger with its careful documentation of every suspicious incident. Jace and Nate corroborated each entry with their own observations. By noon, they'd built a case that even Morrison's money and influence couldn't easily dismiss. "This is substantial," Bridger admitted, reviewing the documentation. "But proving Morrison ordered these actions versus his ranch hands acting independently, that's harder. He'll claim he knew nothing about any of it." "His wife warned us about this specific plan," Eleanor said. "She told us he was plotting to frame us for rustling." Bridger's eyebrows rose. "Catherine Morrison told you that?" "Yes, sir. She came here herself to warn us." "Would she testify to it?" Eleanor thought about the broken woman who'd finally chosen truth over complicity. "I think she might, if she felt protected from retaliation." "That's a big if." Bridger closed his notebook. "But it might be enough to pressure Morrison into backing off. Let me handle this carefully. In the meantime, you three stay alert. A cornered man is a dangerous man." Morrison was indeed dangerous when cornered. That evening, Eleanor found their water supply contaminated with lamp oil. The next day, someone shot at Nate while he was working alone in the far pasture. The bullet missed, but the message was clear. The documentation continued each incident, making Morrison's desperation more obvious. Then Catherine Morrison disappeared. The news came from Sarah Chen, who heard it from the doctor's wife. Catherine had supposedly gone to visit family in Denver, but she'd left without telling anyone, taken only a small bag, and left a note that her husband immediately destroyed. "People are saying she ran off," Sarah reported. But her sister in Denver sent a telegram asking where she was. She never arrived. Eleanor's blood ran cold. "Morrison did something to her. Because she warned us." "You don't know that," Jace cautioned. "She might have just run away from him." "Without telling her own sister, without taking her belongings." Eleanor shook her head. "No, something happened to Catherine Morrison, and her husband knows what." Marshal Bridger thought the same thing. He questioned Morrison repeatedly, but without evidence of foul play, he couldn't make arrests. Catherine's disappearance remained officially unexplained, a mystery that everyone suspected, but no one could prove. The incident changed Eleanor's perspective entirely. Morrison wasn't just greedy or ruthless. He was willing to hurt anyone who stood against him, even his own wife. That made him more dangerous than she'd realized, and more vulnerable. "We need to end this," she told the brothers late one night. "Not just defend against Morrison's attacks, but actually end it. Permanently." "How?" Nate asked. "We've documented everything, reported everything, and it's barely slowed him down." Eleanor thought about Catherine Morrison's sad smile and desperate courage. About the woman who'd finally spoken truth after decades of silence and had vanished for it. About all the ways powerful men hurt people and escaped consequences because everyone was too afraid to testify. "We make him confess," Eleanor said. "We trick him into admitting what he's done where witnesses can hear it." Jace looked skeptical. "Morrison's too smart for that." "Morrison's arrogant. There's a difference." Eleanor pulled out fresh paper and began sketching plans. "He thinks we're beaten. He thinks Catherine's disappearance has scared us into submission. We use that assumption against him. How? Nate leaned forward, interested despite his skepticism. Eleanor smiled grimly. We give Morrison exactly what he wants, the chance to buy the Triple S. We invite him here for negotiations. We record everything he says. And we make sure Marshall Bridger is close enough to hear when Morrison inevitably brags about what he's done. It was risky, possibly illegal, and absolutely necessary. The brothers debated for an hour before agreeing. Then they began planning the trap that would either save the Triple S or destroy them completely. Everything depended on Morrison's pride and Eleanor's ability to make him believe he'd finally won. The letter to Morrison took 3 drafts before Eleanor got the tone exactly right, defeated but not broken, reluctant but realistic. She wrote in her own hand, not the brothers', because Morrison would expect the woman to crack first. Men like him always did. We've reconsidered your offer to purchase the Triple S. Recent events have made us realize that perhaps you were right about our prospects here. We'd like to discuss terms privately away from town gossip. Please come to the ranch Thursday at 2 o'clock. Come alone so we can speak frankly about price without witnesses complicating negotiations. Sincerely, Eleanor Stone. He'll smell a trap, Jace said, reading over her shoulder. He'll smell victory, Eleanor corrected. Morrison spent months trying to break us. He'll see this as confirmation that he's succeeded. His ego won't let him consider we might be playing him. Nate folded the letter carefully. And if we're wrong, if he brings armed men or refuses to come, then we've lost nothing but paper and ink. But if he comes, if his arrogance makes him believe he's untouchable, we'll finally have him. Eleanor met both brothers' eyes. This is our best chance. Maybe our only chance. They sent the letter with a neutral party, a farm boy who delivered messages for spare change. Then they visited Marshall Bridger to explain the plan. Bridger listened with his characteristic careful attention, his weathered face revealing nothing, until Eleanor finished speaking. You're asking me to hide on private property and eavesdrop on a conversation, he said slowly. That's legally questionable at best. We're asking you to position yourself where you might happen to overhear a voluntary confession, Eleanor replied. If Morrison admits to crimes in his own words without coercion, that's admissible testimony. If a judge agrees with your interpretation of voluntary. Bridger drummed his fingers on his desk. But you're right that we need something concrete. Morrison's been untouchable too long. If this works, it'll work, Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. Morrison won't be able to resist gloating. Men who think they've won always need to explain exactly how they did it. And if he doesn't confess, if he just negotiates a normal business transaction, then we sell the ranch and leave with whatever money we can get. We've got nothing left to lose, Marshall. He's already taken everything but the land itself. That wasn't entirely true. They still had each other, still had their partnership, but Bridger didn't need to know the emotional calculations behind their tactical ones. Thursday arrived with unseasonable heat that made the air shimmer and tempers short. Eleanor dressed carefully in her most respectable outfit, pinned her hair back severely, and practiced the expression of exhausted defeat until it looked natural in the mirror. You look like you've given up, Nate observed. That's the idea. Eleanor adjusted her collar. Morrison needs to believe he's broken us completely. The more defeated I seem, the more carelessly he'll talk. Marshall Bridger arrived at noon with his most trusted deputy. They positioned themselves in the barn loft, where ventilation gaps in the walls would let them hear conversations in the yard and on the porch. Eleanor had suggested having them inside the house, but Bridger refused. That crossed too many legal lines, even for frontier justice. Remember, Bridger said before climbing into position, I need him to say something specific and incriminating. Vague implications won't hold up in court. I need names, dates, actions. Understand? We understand, Jace confirmed. We'll steer the conversation where it needs to go. And if things get dangerous, if Morrison threatens violence, we'll intervene immediately. Don't be heroes. Your lives matter more than a confession. Eleanor appreciated the sentiment, but knew the reality was more complicated. Their lives were already in danger. Had been since the moment they'd refused Morrison's first offer. This was simply the endgame of a conflict that had been building for months. Morrison arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, driving himself in an expensive buggy that spoke of wealth Eleanor's family had never possessed. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly wages, and his confidence radiated like heat from a stove. "Mrs. Stone." He removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Gentlemen, thank you for agreeing to see reason." "We're seeing reality," Eleanor said quietly, letting her shoulders slump. "You were right. We can't sustain this ranch against someone determined to destroy it." Something flickered in Morrison's eyes: satisfaction, hunger, vindication. "I take no pleasure in your difficulties. But business is business. This land should be in the hands of someone who can properly develop it." "Someone like you," Nate said flatly. "Exactly like me." Morrison gestured toward the house. "Shall we discuss terms inside?" "Out here is fine," Jace said. "It's cooler with the breeze." Eleanor saw Morrison's slight hesitation. He'd expected indoor privacy walls to contain their conversation. But he recovered quickly, his confidence overriding caution. "Very well. I'm prepared to offer $15,000 for the property, buildings, and all livestock. That's more than fair given current circumstances." Eleanor did the math instantly. The ranch was worth at least $30,000 on the open market, probably more with the breeding stock and water access. Morrison was offering half value, knowing they had no leverage to refuse. "That seems low," she said carefully. "Your original offer 6 months ago was $22,000. 6 months ago, your ranch wasn't notorious for cattle rustling and suspicious fires." Morrison's smile was sharp. "Reputation matters in these transactions, Mrs. Stone. I'm taking a substantial risk buying property with such a clouded title." "We were cleared of those rustling charges," Jace said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Technically cleared, but suspicion remains. People talk. That affects property value." Morrison pulled out a contract he'd clearly prepared in advance. $15,000 cash payment within 1 week of signing. Take it or leave it. Eleanor exchanged looks with the brothers, letting Morrison see their silent debate, their apparent desperation. "We need to discuss this privately." "Of course. I'll wait here." Morrison settled onto the porch railing like he already owned it. They moved to the far side of the yard, speaking in low voices that Morrison would strain to hear, but couldn't quite make out. Eleanor counted to 60, slowly giving the impression of serious discussion, then returned. "We'll accept your offer." She said the words tasting like ash. "But we need to understand something first. Why have you worked so hard to force us out? It can't just be about the land." Morrison's smile widened. "Can't it? This valley could support twice its current population if properly managed. Your little ranch sits right in the middle of the best water access. Without it, my expansion plans are limited. Expansion plans that required cutting our fences, burning our pastures, framing us for theft." Eleanor kept her voice level factual, giving Morrison room to confirm or deny. "Required is a strong word. Let's say those incidents accelerated your decision-making process." Morrison examined his fingernails casually. "You're not the first stubborn family to need encouragement to see reason. Won't be the last either." Nate took a step forward, fists clenched. "You're admitting you sabotaged our ranch." "I'm admitting nothing that matters. You've got no proof, no witnesses, and no legal recourse." Morrison's confidence was absolute. "Even if you recorded this conversation somehow, which you haven't, it would be inadmissible. Entrapment, coercion. Take your pick of legal defenses." "We just want to understand," Eleanor pressed, playing the confused innocent. "The fence cutting the fires, were those your men, or did you order them yourself?" "My men, of course. I don't dirty my own hands with manual labor." Morrison straightened, pleased with himself. "Young Billy Thompson was particularly effective with the fence work. Loyal boy does what he's told without asking questions. Same with Rodriguez and the fire in your eastern pasture. Professional work that. Could have lost your whole barn if I'd wanted, but dead horses don't serve my purposes." I needed you desperate, not destroyed. Eleanor's heart hammered. He was confessing everything, laying out his conspiracy in detail because he believed himself untouchable. She needed to keep him talking. And the cattle-rustling accusation. Elegant solution, wasn't it? Morrison's pride overwhelmed his caution. Move my own cattle onto your land, claim theft force a legal investigation that would tie you up in courts for years. Even if you won, eventually the legal fees would bankrupt you. Then I buy the ranch from the bank for even less than I'm offering now. What about your wife? The question came from Jace, sharp and dangerous. Where is Catherine Morrison? The older man's expression went cold. My wife is none of your business. She came here, warned us about your plans. Then she disappeared. That seems like our business. Catherine left me. Ran off with money she stole from my accounts. I've reported it to the authorities. Morrison's lie was smooth practiced. Whatever she told you was part of her own criminal activity. The woman's become unstable, happens to females of a certain age. Eleanor saw Bridger shift slightly in the barn loft. The marshal was hearing all of this, recording it in his careful lawman's memory. But they needed more. They needed Morrison to fully incriminate himself beyond any possible legal defense. So you've broken laws, destroyed property, and possibly harmed your own wife, all for water access and expansion room. Eleanor let disbelief color her voice. That seems extreme. It's called ambition, Mrs. Stone. Something you'd understand if you came from people of consequence instead of orphanage charity cases. Morrison's contempt was naked now. You're sitting on valuable land you don't have the breeding or brains to properly utilize. I'm simply correcting an inefficiency in resource allocation. By any means necessary, Nate said quietly. Exactly. This is frontier territory. The strong survive, the weak get absorbed. That's natural law older than any statute book. Morrison pulled out a pen. Now are we signing this contract, or should I implement phase 2 of my encouragement program? Because I assure you the next incidents will be significantly less pleasant than fence cutting. What's phase 2? Eleanor asked. Morrison's smile was cruel. Let's just say accidents happen to people, not just property. Ranch work is dangerous. Someone could get badly hurt, maybe fatally hurt, so far from town that help arrives too late. Would be a shame if something happened to you, Mrs. Stone. Pretty young woman like you, so many dangers on the frontier. The threat was explicit, undeniable, and perfectly timed. Eleanor saw Bridger moving in the loft, knew the marshal had heard enough for any reasonable court. But Morrison wasn't finished. I've spent 30 years building my empire in this territory. I've broken men tougher than you Stone boys. I've run off families, bought out widows, and made deals with every judge and politician who matters. You think your little ledger of incidents frightens me? You think anyone will believe the desperate lies of failed ranchers against my word? Morrison laughed. I own this county. The sooner you accept that, the easier your exit becomes. Then I suppose we have no choice, Eleanor said softly. She looked at Jace, and Nate saw their barely controlled rage, their desperate desire for this nightmare to end. We'll sign your contract. Wise decision. Morrison laid the papers on the porch railing. Sign here, here, and here. Both brothers need to sign since you filed joint ownership papers. Jace reached for the pen. His hand was shaking from anger, from frustration, from the sheer injustice of watching their parents' legacy stolen through threats and violence. Eleanor put her hand over his, stopping him. Actually, we've changed our minds, she said clearly. We're not signing anything. Morrison's expression went from triumph to confusion to fury in 3 seconds. What? You heard her, Nate said, stepping forward. We're not selling. Not to you, not for any price. You don't have a choice. I'll destroy you. Marshal Bridger, Eleanor called out. I think you've heard enough. The barn loft door swung open, and Bridger emerged with his deputy, both men armed and grim-faced. Morrison went white, then red, his eyes darting between them and the house as he calculated what they'd heard. "This is entrapment," he sputtered. "Illegal search, inadmissible evidence." "This is private property, and you came here voluntarily," Bridger said. "You confessed to conspiracy, property destruction, theft, fraud, attempted murder, and threatening witnesses. All in your own words, without coercion. We've got 2 law enforcement officers as witnesses." He descended from the loft with deliberate slowness. "Richard Morrison, you're under arrest. You can't prove any of this. It's their word against mine." "It's my word," Bridger corrected. "I'm a territorial marshal, and I just heard you confess to multiple felonies. That's all the proof any judge needs." Morrison lunged for Eleanor with sudden violence, his arm swinging toward her throat. But Nate was faster, intercepting the attack and slamming Morrison against the porch post hard enough to knock the wind from him. "Touch her, and you'll wish the marshal got to you first," Nate said, his voice lethal with promise. The deputy snapped handcuffs on Morrison, while Bridger recited charges that seemed to stretch on forever. Eleanor watched the man who'd terrorized them for months reduced to a cursing, struggling prisoner, and felt no triumph. Only exhaustion. "What about Catherine?" she asked Bridger. "His wife. She's missing." "We'll be investigating that thoroughly," Bridger said grimly. "Morrison's property, his ranch hands everything. If she's alive, we'll find her. If she's not..." He didn't finish the sentence. They took Morrison away in his own expensive buggy, now repurposed as a prisoner transport. Eleanor stood between Jace and Nate, watching dust rise on the road to town, and realized her hands were shaking. "It's over," Jace said, but he sounded uncertain, like he couldn't quite believe it. "Not over," Nate corrected. "But the worst part is done." Eleanor thought about the weeks ahead, testimony trials, Morrison's lawyers trying to discredit them, the slow grinding wheels of frontier justice. Thought about Catherine Morrison, whose fate remained unknown. Thought about all the ways this could still go wrong. "We should tell people what happened," she said. "Sarah Chen, Mrs. Henderson, everyone who's been waiting to see if we'd survive this. They deserve to know." "Tomorrow," Jace said. "Today, we just breathe." They went inside the house that was truly theirs, now the home they'd defended through courage and strategy and desperate gambles that had somehow worked. Eleanor made coffee while the brothers secured the evening chores, and they sat at the kitchen table in silence that felt different from all the silences before, not tense or worried, but simply present. "Your mother would be proud," Eleanor said eventually. "Ma would say we took too many risks," Nate replied. "Would have lectured us for hours about proper planning and safety margins. And then she would have admitted it worked and made us her special dessert as reward," Jace added, smiling at the memory. "What was her special dessert?" Both brothers looked at each other, then back at Eleanor with identical sheepish expressions. "We don't remember," Jace admitted. "Something with apples, maybe. She made it twice a year, but we were always too busy eating it to pay attention to ingredients." Eleanor laughed, the sound startling all three of them. When had she last laughed? Not polite social laughter, but genuine amusement that bubbled up from relief and absurdity and the sheer impossibility of their situation. "We're terrible at preserving her legacy," she said. "We're excellent at preserving the ranch," Nate countered. "That's what mattered to her most." The next week proved Nate right. Marshal Bridger's investigation uncovered enough corroborating evidence to support every charge ranch hands who testified in exchange for immunity, financial records showing payments for sabotage, even a journal Morrison had kept detailing his land acquisition strategies. The territorial judge refused bail, citing flight risk and danger to witnesses. Catherine Morrison was found alive 3 days later, locked in a shed on Morrison's property, with a broken wrist and signs of prolonged abuse. She confirmed every aspect of her husband's confession and added details that made the case against him unshakable. Her testimony, delivered with shaking voice but steady resolve, sealed Morrison's fate. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Eleanor testified for 3 hours, presenting her ledger of incidents with calm precision, while Morrison's lawyers tried to paint her as a calculating seductress who'd corrupted 2 innocent brothers. The strategy backfired spectacularly when Judge Hendricks asked the lawyers if they were seriously arguing that a 23-year-old orphan had somehow orchestrated a massive conspiracy against a wealthy established rancher. "Because if that's your defense," Hendricks said dryly, "you're insulting my intelligence and this court's time." Morrison was convicted on 17 counts, including conspiracy fraud, attempted murder, and kidnapping. The sentence was 25 years hard labor, essentially a life sentence for a man his age. His ranch was seized to pay restitution to his victims, which included the Stones, 4 other families Morrison had driven out over the years, and Catherine Morrison herself. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked Catherine after the verdict, finding her standing outside the courthouse looking lost. "Start over," Catherine said simply. "I'm 52 years old. I've wasted 30 years with a monster, and I've got maybe 20 good years left. I intend to use them better." "You've got friends here if you want them," Eleanor offered. "People who understand starting over." Catherine's smile was still sad, but held a glimmer of something else, hope, maybe, or just the absence of fear. "Thank you, Mrs. Stone. I may take you up on that." Life at the Triple S settled into a new rhythm over the following months. They repaired all the damage Morrison had caused, restocked their depleted feed supplies, and finally had time to focus on the horse breeding program that had been their dream all along. The colts from their breeding stock sold for premium prices that winter, bringing in enough money to secure the ranch's future for years. Eleanor's garden flourished. She'd found her mother-in-law's old journal with planting notes and recipes, and she used it to recreate the vegetable patch that had once fed the family 8 months a year. She also found the recipe for the special dessert apple dumplings with cinnamon sauce and made them one autumn evening while the brothers worked on saddle repairs. "This is it," Jace said after the first bite. "This is exactly what Ma made. How did you figure it out?" "Her journal. She wrote down everything." Eleanor showed them the worn book with its careful handwriting. "She wanted you to be able to recreate her work, even after she was gone." Nate touched the pages reverently. "We should have looked for this years ago." "You weren't ready to look. Sometimes grief needs time before it becomes memory." Eleanor understood this better than most. She'd lost her own mother too young, had spent years unable to think about her without pain. Now you can honor her by continuing what she built. The town's perception of them shifted as well. What had been scandal became simply an unusual but functional arrangement. When Eleanor walked through Redemption Ridge, now people greeted her by name, asked about the ranch, complimented her on the horses they'd seen. Martha still sniffed disapprovingly, but even she stopped spreading malicious gossip. Mrs. Henderson became an unexpected ally, defending the Stones when anyone questioned their setup. "Eleanor Stone has more backbone than half the men in this territory," she'd say loudly. "And those boys treat her better than most husbands treat their wives. So maybe the problem isn't with them. Maybe it's with us. Being too narrow-minded to see different doesn't mean wrong." Sarah Chen went further, becoming Eleanor's genuine friend. They had tea every Tuesday, sharing recipes and gossip, and the kind of easy companionship that Eleanor had never experienced before. Sarah's husband taught Nate and Jace improved horse training techniques he'd learned in California, and the exchange of knowledge enriched both families. "You're happy," Sarah observed one afternoon, watching Eleanor's face. "Really happy. I wasn't sure at first when you arrived looking so uncertain. But now I see it, you found where you belong." Eleanor considered the question seriously. Was she happy? Happiness had never been a goal she'd thought achievable, not for an orphan with no prospects and no family. She'd aimed for survival, maybe occasional security if she was lucky. But now she woke each morning to work she found meaningful, to partners who respected her judgment, to a home that was truly hers. She went to sleep each night tired from honest labor, safe behind walls she'd helped defend, planning tomorrow's tasks with people who valued her input. That wasn't just survival. That was something better. "Yes," she said. "I'm happy." It surprised me too. Winter brought its own challenges: bitter cold snow that drifted higher than the fence posts, and the constant work of keeping livestock alive through brutal weather. But they'd prepared properly this time, with Eleanor's careful planning, ensuring adequate hay stores, weatherproofed buildings, and emergency supplies. One particularly fierce evening, with wind howling outside and the stove working overtime, they sat together in the living room that had once felt too masculine and empty. Eleanor had added curtains she'd sewn herself, throw pillows made from fabric scraps, and small touches that made the space feel inhabited. The brothers had built extra bookshelves for the volumes Eleanor collected, and together they'd created something that looked like an actual home rather than just shelter. "Tell us about Boston," Jace said suddenly. "You never talk about before you came here." Eleanor set down her mending, surprised by the question. "There's not much to tell. I was moved between families who took in charity cases. Some were kinder than others. All of them made it clear I was temporary." "That must have been lonely," Nate said quietly. "It was, but it taught me to recognize when something real came along." Eleanor looked at both of them. "This is real. This ranch, this partnership, this family we've built. I know it because I've experienced enough false versions to tell the difference." "We're glad you stayed," Jay said. "Not just because you saved the ranch with your planning, though you did, but because you made this place feel complete, like it was waiting for you all along." Eleanor felt warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. "I was waiting for it too. I just didn't know what I was waiting for until I arrived, and two men stood where I expected one." They laughed together, the sound filling the small room and pushing back against the winter darkness outside. It was a good sound, Eleanor thought. The sound of people who'd chosen each other, despite impossible odds, and had somehow made it work. "We should plant more apple trees come spring," Nate said. "For the dumplings. Ma only had 4 trees and they're getting old. We could put in a whole orchard." "That would take years to mature," Eleanor pointed out. "We've got years. We're not going anywhere." The simple confidence in Nate's voice spoke volumes. They were building for a future they now believed would actually arrive. No more desperate survival. No more wondering if tomorrow would bring disaster. Just steady work toward long-term goals, the way the brothers' parents had once built this ranch from nothing. "An orchard sounds perfect," Eleanor agreed. "We'll plant it together." Outside, the Wyoming wind sang across the prairie, carrying snow and cold, and the promise of spring somewhere beyond the winter. Inside the Triple S ranch house, 3 people who'd found each other through a lie that became truth sat planning the future they'd fought so hard to secure. The ranch their parents had built would continue. The family they'd chosen would endure. And Eleanor Whitmore Stone, who'd arrived expecting one man and found 2, discovered that sometimes the best things in life came from circumstances that seemed impossible until you had the courage to live them anyway. Spring arrived with a violence that surprised Eleanor even after surviving a Wyoming winter. The snow melted in rushing torrents that turned the creek into a roaring beast. The frozen ground gave way to mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels, and life exploded across the prairie in shades of green she'd forgotten existed during the months of white and gray. They planted the apple orchard on the first warm Saturday in April, all 3 of them working in companionable rhythm that no longer required much discussion. Eleanor marked the spots according to her mother-in-law's journal notes about spacing and sun exposure. Jace dug the holes with steady efficiency, while Nate prepared each sapling, trimming roots and checking for disease. It was simple work, repetitive and satisfying, the kind of labor that let minds wander while hands stayed busy. "Ma always said you plant trees for people you'll never meet," Jace said, tamping earth around a young trunk. "Said that's what makes it holy work. You're giving to the future without expecting anything back." Eleanor wiped dirt from her hands. "Then we're planting these for our children, and their children after them." The words hung in the air, more significant than she'd intended. They'd never discussed children explicitly, though the possibility hovered in the background of every long-term plan they made. Eleanor was 24 now, married a year, and frontier women her age usually had 2 or 3 babies already. But their situation was complicated enough without adding that particular complexity. Nate cleared his throat. "You want children." Someday, yes. Eleanor met his eyes, then Jace's. Do you? Ma wanted grandchildren, Jace said carefully. Used to talk about filling this house with noise and chaos, but that was before everything got complicated. Eleanor finished. She sat back on her heels, studying both brothers. We've avoided this conversation long enough. We need to decide how this household actually functions beyond work and survival. What are you asking exactly? Nate's discomfort was obvious. I'm asking how we handle the parts of marriage we've been dancing around for a year. Eleanor forced herself to speak plainly despite the heat in her cheeks. We share a household, share work, share legal ownership of this ranch. But we've been living like business partners with separate rooms. That's fine if it's what we all want. But if we're planting orchards for grandchildren who don't exist yet, we need to figure out how they're going to come to exist. Jace laughed suddenly, the sound breaking the tension. Leave it to Eleanor to make starting a family sound like a contract negotiation. Someone has to be practical about it. Eleanor fought a smile. You two certainly weren't going to bring it up. Fair point, Nate admitted. He set down his shovel and sat on the grass, gesturing for the others to join him. All right, let's talk about it properly. What do you want, Eleanor? How do you see this working? Eleanor had thought about this question for months, turning it over during endless chores and sleepless nights. She'd grown up in charity homes, where women whispered about bedroom duties like they were discussing prison sentences, where marriage seemed like a trap that stole freedom and gave nothing back. But she'd also watched her mother-in-law's journals transform from courtship notes to partnership documentation, had seen how respect and affection could grow between people who worked toward common goals. I want what your parents had, she said slowly. A partnership built on trust and shared purpose. I want children raised in a house where love isn't scarce, where they see adults working together instead of tearing each other down. And I want honesty about how we get there, even if the path looks different than what other families follow. Different how? Jace asked. Eleanor took a breath. I think we stop pretending this is a conventional marriage with one husband and a convenient extra rancher who happens to live here. I think we acknowledge that this household has 3 partners, not 2 plus 1 auxiliary, and we structure our family accordingly. Nate's expression was unreadable. You're saying, I'm saying I came here expecting to marry one man. I ended up married to one man legally and partnered with both of you practically. That's reality. We can keep pretending it's something else, or we can accept what we've built and move forward honestly. The silence stretched long enough that Eleanor's courage nearly failed. Then Jace spoke quietly. Ma used to say the worst sin was lying to yourself about what your life actually was. She said people wasted years pretending to be something they weren't, then woke up one day wondering where the time went. He pulled up a handful of grass, letting it fall through his fingers. I don't want to waste years pretending this is something it's not. Neither do I, Nate said. But Eleanor, you understand what you're proposing. The talk that'll come, the judgment, the I've survived judgment my entire life. Eleanor interrupted. Being an unwed mother's bastard child teaches you that people will condemn you regardless of what you actually do. Might as well live honestly and let them talk. You'd bear children without knowing. Jace stopped searching for diplomatic phrasing. Without knowing which of you fathered them. Yes. Eleanor's voice was steady. Because it doesn't matter. Any child born in this house will be a stone, will be raised by all 3 of us, will belong equally to this family. That's more than most children get, more than I ever had. Nate looked at his brother. They had that silent communication Eleanor had learned to recognize entire conversations happening in seconds through eye contact and minute expressions. Finally, Nate nodded. Then we do this right, he said. No sneaking around, no pretending. We're a family of 3 adults who've chosen each other. We raise any children as ours collectively, and we defend that choice against anyone who takes issue with it. Agreed, Jace said. But Eleanor, you need to know if this becomes too hard, if the judgment weighs too heavy, if you change your mind about any of it, you can say so. The door you locked that first night still has a lock. You always have a choice. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched tight. They were giving her the same thing they'd offered that first day space choice: respect. The knowledge that she could change her mind at any time made it easier to commit fully. "I'm not changing my mind," she said. "I've made my choice. Both of you. This ranch, this family, all of it." They finished planting the orchard as the sun climbed higher, and Eleanor felt the shift in the air between them, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. They'd named what they were building instead of dancing around it. Sometimes naming things gave them power to become fully real. That evening, after supper and chores, Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room. The room that was still hers, still private, still locked when she chose. But she didn't lock it that night. The door stayed open, an invitation to the future they'd agreed to build. The months that followed brought changes both subtle and profound. Jace moved his carpentry tools out of the spare room next to Eleanor's, converting it into a proper nursery. Nate built a larger table that could seat more people, planning for the family meals they'd someday share with children and grandchildren. Eleanor sewed curtains and quilts, preparing for futures that existed only in imagination, but felt increasingly real with each stitch. They also formalized their partnership legally as much as frontier law allowed. They registered the SSS as jointly owned by all three names, with Judge Hendricks, who'd proven himself trustworthy during Morrison's trial. They drew up wills ensuring that if anything happened to any of them, the survivors would inherit everything equally. They even wrote letters to be opened in case of their deaths, explaining their choices to hypothetical children who might someday need to understand. "This feels morbid," Eleanor said, sealing her letter with wax. "This feels necessary," Hendricks corrected. He'd agreed to witness their documents privately, understanding the delicacy of their situation. "You're building something unconventional. That means you need ironclad legal protection, so no distant relative can come swooping in claiming impropriety after you're gone." "Will these documents hold up in court?" Jace asked. "They should. Wyoming territory has always been progressive about women's rights and property ownership. And I'll testify to your sound minds and clear intentions if necessary." Hendricks stamped the final document. "For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is brave. Families come in all shapes. Love doesn't have to fit neat categories to be real." Eleanor carried those words with her through the summer as her body began to change in ways that announced pregnancy before any doctor could confirm it. The morning sickness hit hard and stayed persistent, leaving her exhausted and irritable for weeks. Both brothers hovered like anxious mother hens, which alternately touched her and drove her to distraction. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she snapped after Nate tried to carry her upstairs. "Women have been doing this since Eve. I can manage." "Ma nearly died having us," Nate said quietly. "Twins complicated the birth. The doctor said she shouldn't have more children after. So forgive us for worrying." Eleanor's irritation evaporated. She'd known the brothers were twins, but hadn't considered what that might mean for their mother's health, or their own fears about pregnancy and childbirth. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know." "No reason you should. Ma didn't talk about it much." Jace sat beside her on the porch steps. "But it scared Pa badly. And it scares us now, watching you go through this." "Then we'll be scared together," Eleanor said. "But I'm still climbing my own stairs." Dr. Morrison, no relation to Richard, thank God, confirmed the pregnancy in July and estimated a February delivery. He was a practical man who delivered half the babies in the territory and didn't ask uncomfortable questions about family arrangements. "You're healthy, the baby's developing normally, and you've got good support at home," he said after the examination. "That's more than many women have. Just rest when your body tells you to rest, eat when you can keep food down, and don't do anything stupidly dangerous." "Define stupidly dangerous," Eleanor said. "Breaking horses, lifting anything heavier than a water bucket, or working outdoors in extreme weather. Basically use common sense and you'll be fine." Common sense meant adjusting how they divided ranch work. Eleanor took over the account books entirely, managed the garden with help for heavy lifting, and handled the cooking while Jace and Nate split the physical labor. It wasn't perfect. Eleanor chafed at restrictions, and both brothers worried constantly, but they made it work through communication and compromise. The baby's first movements came in late September. Gentle flutters that Eleanor barely recognized until they grew stronger and more definite. She was alone in the kitchen when she felt the unmistakable sensation of another life moving inside her own body. For a moment, she stood frozen, hand pressed to her stomach, overwhelmed by the reality of what they'd set in motion. "You all right?" Nate appeared in the doorway, probably drawn by her stillness. The baby moved. Eleanor's voice came out hushed, reverent. "I just felt it move." Nate crossed the kitchen in 3 strides. May I feel?" Eleanor guided his hand to where the movement had been strongest. They waited, and just when she thought the moment had passed, the baby moved again, a distinct roll that pushed against both their palms. Nate's expression transformed into something Eleanor had never seen on his weathered face, pure wonder mixed with terror and hope. "That's real. That's a person in there." "Getting more real by the day," Eleanor agreed. Jace found them like that, Eleanor's hand over Nate's, both pressed against her growing belly, both grinning like idiots. He joined them without asking, his larger hand covering theirs, and they stood connected in a moment that felt almost sacred. "Boy or girl, do you think?" Jace asked. "Healthy," Eleanor said firmly. "That's all I'm hoping for. Everything else is bonus." "Ma used to say children were God's way of teaching humility," Nate recalled. "Said she spent 9 months planning how she'd be the perfect mother. Then we arrived and destroyed every plan she'd made within the first week." "Comforting," Eleanor said dryly. "She also said we were the best thing she ever did," Jace added. "Said all the plans we destroyed didn't matter compared to what we actually were." Eleanor thought about the plans she'd made in Boston, or rather the complete absence of plans beyond mere survival. She'd never imagined children because children required stability she'd never possessed. Now here she was, 6 months pregnant on a Wyoming ranch, partnered with 2 men in an arrangement that would scandalize proper society, and somehow feeling more prepared for motherhood than she'd ever thought possible. "We should pick names," she said. "Something that honors your parents without being too obvious." They debated names for weeks. Eleanor vetoed anything too common or too unusual. Jace argued for family names. Nate wanted something that sounded strong. They finally compromised on several options, agreeing to decide after meeting the baby. "Because sometimes," Eleanor said wisely, "you don't know who they are until you see their face." Winter returned with familiar harshness, but the house felt different this year. Warmer somehow, despite being the same building with the same stove, fighting the same cold. Eleanor understood why when she watched Jace building a cradle in the workshop, his hands shaping wood with the same careful attention he'd once given to breaking horses. Or when Nate read aloud from a book on child-rearing he'd bought in town, his gruff voice stumbling over medical terminology, but persisting anyway. They were becoming parents together, each contributing what they could to preparation for this unknown person who'd soon disrupt every routine they'd established. Catherine Morrison visited in December, bringing baby clothes she'd sewn herself. She'd opened a small dressmaking shop in town and was building a quiet life that seemed to suit her much better than her previous existence as a wealthy rancher's wife. "I thought you might need these," she said, presenting a bundle of tiny garments. "I made them for the children Richard and I never had. Seems fitting they go to someone who'll actually use them." Eleanor accepted the gift with tears that came too easily these days, another pregnancy symptom Dr. Morrison had warned her about. "They're beautiful. Thank you." "How are you feeling?" Catherine asked over tea. Eleanor could actually stomach now that morning sickness had passed. Terrified, excited, exhausted, and hopeful, sometimes all at once. Eleanor shifted in her chair, trying to find a comfortable position that no longer existed. "Is that normal?" "Perfectly normal." I helped deliver enough babies in my younger days to know that women feeling nothing but joy about pregnancy are either lying or saints, and I've met very few saints. Catherine stirred her tea thoughtfully. You're building something remarkable here, Eleanor. I hope you know that. Some days I think we're building something wonderful. Other days I think we're creating a disaster that'll hurt everyone involved. That's called being human. We make choices not knowing how they'll turn out, then live with the consequences as best we can. Catherine's smile was gentle. For what it's worth, I think your children will be lucky. They'll grow up seeing adults who chose each other, who work together, who face problems as a unit. That's rarer than you might think. Eleanor carried those words through Christmas preparations, her first real Christmas, with family, with traditions, with people who wanted her there, instead of tolerating her presence as charity. They cut a small pine tree and decorated it with paper chains Eleanor made and carved ornaments Jace produced from scraps of wood. They cooked an elaborate meal together, bumping into each other in the small kitchen, laughing when flour ended up on everyone's clothes. Ma would have loved this, Nate said, watching Eleanor attempt to wrestle a turkey into the oven while 7 months pregnant. Would have said you've got spirit. Your mother would have actually gotten the turkey in the oven on the first try, Eleanor countered. I've got clumsiness. Same thing according to Ma. She said spirit was just clumsiness pointed in a useful direction. They ate by candlelight, the three of them, plus Catherine, whom they'd invited because nobody should be alone on Christmas. They told stories about Christmases past, Eleanor's mostly grim, theirs bittersweet with the loss of their parents, Catherine's carefully edited to avoid discussing her ex-husband. But the evening still felt warm, safe, full of the kind of belonging Eleanor had stopped believing existed. January brought false labor that terrified everyone and sent them rushing to fetch Dr. Morrison in a midnight panic. He examined Eleanor, declared it perfectly normal practice contractions, and went home grumbling about nervous first-time parents. This is going to be a long month, Eleanor said after he left, embarrassed by the false alarm. We'll survive it, Jace said. Probably. Definitely, Nate corrected. We've survived everything else. We'll survive this too. The real labor started on a February morning so cold that ice crystals formed on the inside of the windows. Eleanor's water broke while she was cooking breakfast, soaking through her dress and puddling on the floor in a way that would have been humiliating if she hadn't been immediately gripped by a contraction that took her breath away. Get Dr. Morrison, she gasped when she could speak again. Now. Jace ran for town while Nate helped Eleanor upstairs, his face pale beneath weathered tan. They'd prepared the bedroom with clean linens, hot water, and supplies Dr. Morrison had specified. Now all they could do was wait and try not to panic as contractions grew stronger and closer together. Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, professionally calm, in a way that helped Eleanor focus. First babies take their time. Could be hours yet. Just breathe through the contractions and save your strength for pushing. Hours was an understatement. Labor stretched through the day and into evening, relentless waves of pain that erased everything except the immediate moment. Eleanor gripped Nate's hand hard enough to leave bruises, cursed everyone involved in getting her pregnant, and seriously reconsidered every life choice that had led to this moment. You're doing great, Dr. Morrison said, checking her progress. Almost ready to push. I'm dying, Eleanor panted. You're not dying. Women have been doing this since Eve, remember. You said that yourself. I was an idiot. Eve was an idiot. This is terrible design. Another contraction hit, and Eleanor screamed through gritted teeth. Downstairs, she could hear Jace pacing his boots, wearing a path in the floorboards. He'd wanted to be upstairs too, but 3 people plus a doctor in the bedroom was too crowded. So he paced and worried, and waited like fathers had waited since the beginning of time. Finally, as the clock struck midnight and February 15th arrived, Eleanor felt the overwhelming urge to push. Dr. Morrison positioned himself, gave terse instructions, and Eleanor bore down with every ounce of strength she had left. 3 pushes later, a baby's cry filled the room, thin and furious, and absolutely perfect. It's a girl, Dr. Morrison announced, placing the squalling infant on Eleanor's chest. Healthy lungs, good color, all fingers and toes present. Eleanor stared at the tiny red face, the miniature hands that grasped at air, the eyes that couldn't focus yet, but seemed to be searching for something. This person, this actual human person, had been inside her moments ago, and now existed separately, demanding attention with impressive volume. She's beautiful. Nate said, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor. She's perfect. Get Jace, Eleanor whispered, unable to look away from her daughter. He needs to meet her. Jace burst into the room seconds later, probably having been hovering just outside the door. He stopped short when he saw the baby, his expression cycling through shock, joy, and something that might have been tears if men like him admitted to crying. Come here, Eleanor said. Come meet your daughter. Jace approached slowly, like the baby might break if he moved too fast. He touched one tiny hand with a finger the size of the infant's whole arm, and Eleanor watched him fall completely in love in the space of a heartbeat. What's her name? Dr. Morrison asked, cleaning up with efficient movements. Eleanor looked at both brothers, seeing her own wonder reflected in their faces. Sarah Catherine Stone, after the women who taught me that family isn't just blood, it's choice. Sarah Catherine Stone, Jace repeated. It's perfect. They took turns holding her that night after Dr. Morrison left, with promises to check on them in 2 days. Sarah, tiny, red, impossibly fragile, seemed completely unaware that her family was unconventional. She just knew she was held warm and safe, surrounded by voices that would learn to become familiar. She has your chin, Nate observed, studying the baby's face. And your stubborn expression, Jace added. Look at that scowl. That's pure stone determination. Eleanor laughed weakly, exhausted beyond measure, but unwilling to sleep yet. We did it. We actually made a whole person. You did it, Nate corrected. We just provided moral support and panic. And you'll provide diaper changes and midnight feedings, so don't get too comfortable with that moral support role. Eleanor's smile was wicked despite her exhaustion. We're all parents now. That means we all handle the unpleasant parts too. The first weeks were exactly as chaotic as promised. Sarah constantly slept in unpredictable bursts and cried for reasons that seemed to change hourly. Eleanor learned to sleep whenever the baby slept, to eat with one hand while holding an infant with the other, and to function on less rest than she'd thought humanly possible. But she also discovered depths of love she hadn't known existed. The way Sarah's tiny hand would grip her finger. The milk-drunk expression after successful feeding. The way the baby would quiet when held against a heartbeat, any heartbeat she wasn't particular, seeking comfort in the simple proof that she wasn't alone. Jace and Nate proved surprisingly competent at baby care, though they approached it differently. Jace was nervous and gentle, treating Sarah like she might shatter at any moment. Nate was matter-of-fact, changing diapers with the same efficient calm he brought to all practical tasks. Both of them fell asleep in chairs regularly, baby on their chest, too exhausted to make it to bed. We look like disasters, Eleanor said one morning, surveying their collective appearance, all three adults rumpled, unwashed, and sporting impressive dark circles under their eyes. We look like parents, Jace corrected. This is what it's supposed to look like. Spring arrived again, another cycle completed, another year begun. Eleanor stood in the orchard they'd planted, holding Sarah, who was now 3 months old, and beginning to notice the world around her. The apple trees had leafed out tiny green promises of future fruit. Your grandparents planted the original trees, Eleanor told her daughter, who stared at her with solemn eyes. Your fathers and I planted these new ones. Someday, you'll plant your own trees for your own children. That's how families work. We give to futures we'll never see. Sarah made a noise that might have been agreement, or might have been gas. Eleanor chose to interpret it as agreement. Behind her, she heard Jace and Nate discussing fence repairs, their voices carrying the easy rhythm of people who'd worked together so long, they barely needed full sentences anymore. She heard the horses in the paddock, the creek running high with snowmelt, the wind moving through grass that would soon need cutting for hay. she heard home. Town had mostly accepted their arrangement by now, helped by Sarah's birth and the undeniable evidence that the Triple S household was successfully raising a child. There were still whispers, still judgment, still women like Martha, who sniffed disapprovingly whenever Eleanor walked past. But there were more people like Sarah Chen and Mrs. Henderson and Catherine Morrison, people who'd learned that different didn't automatically mean wrong. "How's our girl?" Nate asked, joining Eleanor in the orchard. "Perfect." Eleanor transferred the baby to his arms, watching him automatically adjust his grip to support her head properly. "And getting heavier every day. Soon she won't be a baby anymore." "Good thing babies are easier to make than apple orchards." Nate's grin was wicked. "We can always have more. Let me survive the first one before we discuss sequels." But Eleanor smiled, because the idea of more children didn't terrify her anymore. They'd proven they could do this, could build a family that functioned despite not following conventional patterns. Judge Hendricks visited that afternoon to file Sarah's birth certificate and ensure all their legal documents were properly updated. He held the baby with practiced ease while reviewing paperwork. "You're listing both men as fathers," he observed neutrally. "Both men are fathers," Eleanor said firmly. "They'll both raise her, teach her, provide for her. The biology is less important than the commitment." Wyoming territory might actually accept that reasoning. We've always been progressive about women's rights and family structures. Hendricks signed the documents with a flourish. "Consider it officially recorded, Sarah Catherine Stone, daughter of Eleanor Stone, Jacob Stone, and Nathaniel Stone. 3 legal parents, 1 family unit." After he left, Eleanor found both brothers standing over Sarah's cradle, watching her sleep with expressions of absolute devotion. "We're really doing this," Jace said quietly. "Building something completely new." "We built it already," Eleanor corrected. "Now we're just living it." And they did live it through Sarah's first words and first steps, through the second pregnancy that brought twin boys and made them all laugh at the genetic poetry of it, through droughts and good years and everything between. They built additions onto the house as their family grew. They trained horses that won races across 3 territories. They planted more trees, harvested apples, made the cinnamon dumplings that became tradition. They aged together. Eleanor's dark hair going gray at the temples, the brothers' faces weathering into leather that mapped every year spent under Wyoming sun. They buried friends, welcomed grandchildren, watched the territory become a state, and the frontier slowly disappear into civilization. Through it all, the Triple S endured, not because it was easy, but because 3 people had chosen each other against all conventional wisdom and had refused to let judgment or hardship break what they'd built. On their 30th anniversary, measured from that first day when Eleanor stepped off the stagecoach expecting 1 man and found 2, they stood together in the orchard that had grown thick and productive. Their children and grandchildren ran between the trees, playing the same games the brothers had probably played decades earlier. "Any regrets?" Nate asked Eleanor, his arm around her waist. Eleanor thought about the scared orphan girl who'd arrived with $7 and a marriage contract. Thought about the choice she'd made to stay, to trust, to build something that had no template or guarantee of success. Thought about the family that now sprawled across the valley, all of them carrying the Stone name forward into futures their grandparents had only dreamed of. "Not one single regret," she said. "You." "Only that we didn't plant more apple trees," Jace said, and they all laughed because even after 30 years, he could still surprise her. The prairie wind sang through the orchard branches, carrying the voices of children who would someday plant their own trees for their own grandchildren. And Eleanor Stone, once, Eleanor Whitmore, orphan and charity case, stood between 2 men who'd given her something no matrimonial agency could promise, a home built on choice, respect, and the revolutionary act of defining family by commitment instead of convention. Love wasn't about ownership or fitting into neat categories. It was about who stood beside you when storms hit, and who helped you plant orchards you'd never live to see fully mature. Eleanor had learned that lesson in Wyoming's unforgiving soil, and she'd teach it to every generation that came after, ensuring the Stone family legacy was measured not in land or money, but in the radical courage of choosing your own path and walking it without apology.